I'm Joshua Sparrow at the Brazelton Touchpoint Center, and this is Learning to Listen, Conversations for Change. To find out more about the Brazelton Touchpoint Center and Learning to Listen, just go to brazeltontouchpoints.org and click on the Offerings tab or the Webinars tab. Today, we will be listening to Dr. Melissa Walls, who will share with us what she is learning from Indigenous children and families and all the ways that their cultures give them meaning, strength, and direction. In just a moment, you'll find out why we are so grateful to Melissa for joining us today. But first, a bit of information about today's Learning to Listen episode. Over 1,600 people have registered for today's webinar. It's wonderful to see you all in the chat, so please do tell us who you are, where you're from, and what you do. We love hearing from you. Today, our wonderful interpreter, Maria Jose Gutierrez, joining us all the way from Bogota, Colombia, will be simultaneously translating our webinar in Spanish. Thank you once again, Maria Jose. To access the translation, click on the interpretation icon in your Zoom controls, then select Spanish. To mute the English in the background, select Mute Original Audio. La conversación de hoy será en español y inglés. En los controles de esta reunión, haga clic en interpretación, haga clic en el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. Para escuchar solo el español, haga clic en silenciar audio original. We are also providing closed captions today for those who would like to use them. To turn captioning on, please click on the closed caption icon in your Zoom controls and select Show Subtitle. You can adjust the size for the subtitles. Please use the chat feature if you have a comment to share or need help with a technical issue. Please do put your questions for Dr. Walls in the Q&A box, and we will try to pause a few times along the way to respond to your questions. If you would like to receive a certificate of attendance, and folks always ask about this, for today's webinar, please be sure you complete the feedback survey. Now, this survey will open in your web browser when the webinar ends today, but you will also receive a link to the survey tomorrow in our thank you email to you. And that email will also include a link to today's webinar recording. The survey and webinar recording will be available in both English and Spanish. And you can also access the recordings of today's webinar and our other Learning to Listen webinars on our YouTube channel and again at brazeltontouchpoints.org. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsor, the Burke Foundation, and our Brazelton Touchpoint Center production team, Isabella Mantilla, Shella Merchant-Juma, Michael Accardi, Ashley Gaddis, and Suzanne Okasik. And now, I'd like to introduce today's guest, Dr. Melissa Walls, who is an Anishinaabe social scientist working in collaboration with Indigenous communities in what is now called the United States and Canada on health equity research and culturally relevant public health programming. Dr. Walls is an associate professor of American health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and director of the Great Lakes Hub of the Johns Hopkins University Center for American Indian Health. Dr. Walls serves as the principal investigator with a longstanding research team that includes Anishinaabe community members and academic researchers working together to understand and address the social, historical, and contemporary determinants of inequitable health outcomes. Dr. Walls, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Just want to get us rolling here. It's so fun to see all of the people in the chat where you're calling in from. So hello, relatives from all over North America and beyond. It looks to be represented here. I'm just going to speak in my traditional language briefly. So Buju, Memengwan, Indishinakas, Magizi, Duadam. You heard my name. I'm Eagle Clan. I am Boys Fort and Couchiching First Nation Anishinaabe from my mother, German and Swedish from my father. And I just want to say hello. Hello, everybody. I hope you have a nice cup of tea, a nice cup of coffee, or afternoon water, whatever you need. This is a photo taken from actually right where I'm sitting 2 weeks ago. Turned my body to the left and took this photograph. I sit here on the traditional lands of the Fond du Lac people, Anishinaabe people. These are their waterways. This is a little lake that I am so fortunate now to be a steward of. And I want to acknowledge this land because so many of us continue to benefit from stolen lands on the one hand, and or are harmed from the taking of those lands. And I just want to encourage everyone to think about moving beyond land acknowledgement. So here's a great resource if you're interested, where you can pay attention to action. I think land acknowledgements are becoming kind of en vogue. People know how to do them now, and a lot of agencies are working on them. But what do we do next? So I encourage anyone with curiosity to check out this online guide. I think it's wonderful. It helps us to move beyond optical allyship, the appearance of being an ally without having to break a sweat. And you can see the question on the screen. Are you ignoring how your institution has harmed and continues to harm Indigenous communities? We should all be interrogating that. So with that, I'm trying to do that very thing at Johns Hopkins University. This is where I work. Johns Hopkins was a man. He was a slave owner, and we are working to really come to terms with, figure out ways to heal and take action in the wake of the name that sits on our university. We also sit on the lands of many Indigenous peoples worldwide. And I feel honored to be a part of our Center for Indigenous Health. We used to be called the Center for American Indian Health until about a month ago. This was founded about 35 years ago, primarily due to work from our founder, Dr. Matu Santosham. He did infectious disease work in partnership with communities. And we've expanded since then to work on all sorts of health issues. But I'm pretty new to Johns Hopkins, so it wasn't until 2019 that we opened what we call the Great Lakes Hub of our center here in Duluth, Minnesota. So before this time, I worked at the University of Minnesota as a researcher. Before that, I was at the University of Nebraska for a bit. And before that, I was, my primary identity was daughter, sister, granddaughter, relative. And so I'm going to take you today on a journey with me, sort of, through that transition to becoming a researcher, and show you what our team has learned through this tool we call research. It won't be too much of an autobiography, but I'll slip in some little autobiographical bits along the way. And I will end today sharing words from my relatives that I hope you feel inspired by to go out and start or finish your day, depending on where you are. I know we have a diverse audience, so I wanted to give us equal kind of baseline for thinking about Indigenous people in the United States and Canada. So I'm going to focus on the US here and share that there are a lot of us, right? There's nearly 600 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Many more tribes are not recognized at all. Some are recognized at the state level, and we are all over the place. We are on reservations, we are rural, suburban. We still cover the territories that are now, as Josh said, are now called the United States. Recent census data shows explosive growth in our population for a variety of reasons, but right now there's 10 million people who identify as Indigenous in terms of American Indian or Alaska Native in the United States. There are other aspects of indigeneity, including Indigenous peoples of what is now called Mexico, Latin America, other words that are given to that area. I am going to focus mostly on American Indian and First Nations people in Canada. In the United States, most Native folks live off reservations, which is a surprise to many people. So a lot of research and resources go to reservations, but most of us are living off res lands. Like all human cultures, we are changing. We're very diverse. And we have some of the most extreme health inequities in this nation. I'm going to show you an example of this. And I will walk you through the many lines on this chart. So what you're seeing here are projected trends in premature death, so early mortality, from 1990 to 2030. If the line is going down, the group is projected to continue to live longer. So that's good. Line going down, good. If the line goes up, premature death rates are growing, bad. The top line, for those who can see the color green, is American Indian Alaska Natives. We are dying younger than other groups, and our relatives are projected to only die younger and younger up through 2030. Many other health issues underlie this: diabetes, other chronic diseases. But this single fact that we live fewer years of life is heartbreaking and not okay. And it was not always like this. So in the case of Indigenous peoples, we know from research, we know from common sense that this unequal health pathway is deeply rooted in what we call colonization. And that process is often described as historical trauma. And this talk is not about historical trauma, but I would love for all of you to just remember that the unequal health of my community, of other Indigenous communities, is in spite of our many strengths. It is in spite of our persistence. It is not because we are Native, it is in spite of us being Native, right? So there's a lot that goes into historical trauma, but the idea that our children could be taken, put in boarding schools, that our communities were forcibly marched across the country to other lands, that we were sent in the 1950s and 60s to live in cities where this was a major culture shock, where our foodways and our ways of moving our bodies have been drastically changed, and where cultural practices and wisdom was literally illegal. It was illegal to practice our spiritual ways through the 1970s. There's no surprise that there has been impact. So again, the social determinants are deep. They run all the way back to first contact with Europeans. And it is a big part of the story. There's also a ton of myths and fallacies about us that I want to mention, especially at this time of the year. So let's pause and just think. Think of the word Native American, American Indian, Alaska Native, First Nations, Métis. When you hear this, what images come into your head? You can think about this. I ask this to students. I ask them to be honest, and some of the things that I hear sound a lot like this looks. So Halloween is next week, and just yesterday I Googled sexy princess Indian costume, and I got all kinds of answers from Google, including a little girl. On one hand, it's shocking. You can still order these costumes. On the other, it is no shock. And you can get them for men too, right? So they're out there. These are some of the stereotypes that represent myths about Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to share the words of Sarah Sunshine Manning. She wrote this essay for NDN Collective, Indian Collective. And you can look it up. This is a screenshot from her essay. It's beautiful, but look at the subtitle. When you see a group as subhuman, it's easier to harm them. It's easier to cast them off to the margins of society, to be colonized, brutalized, and silenced. This is the Indigenous experience. She goes on. We have historically been robbed of our ability to define ourselves for ourselves. We see our experience deeply embedded in harmful stereotypes. This includes what we get taught in school, literature, pop culture, Hollywood films, the savage Indian mascots, the hypersexualized Indian maiden Halloween costume. I just showed you those. When we do see modern representations of Native people, it's often some recycled story. I'm going to skip down. She says, this evidence of anti-indigeneity is ever present. But where are the stories of Indigenous humanity? The stories of our past and present contributions, of our complexity, of the beauty of our souls. That is so powerful, of the beauty of our souls. I don't know that research is the right tool. It's definitely not the only tool to be able to share the stories of our humanity. But in our brief time together today, I'm going to try to share a few examples of what I see as beautiful in our communities that I have been fortunate to learn about as a researcher working with our communities. Okay, but research, the R word. Some people say that's a dirty word. You know, it is, it can be. Research has historically harmed most communities, all communities. It hasn't always done us good. And there are a lot of actually myths and fallacies that we can perpetuate through research. So as early as, I think, the 1980s, Dr. Phil May wrote about the myths and realities of Native American alcohol use. He was an early mentor to me. And Dr. May wrote about the fact that so many people stereotype Native folks to be drunken Indians, to have a genetic predisposition to addiction. And the research just doesn't meet that stereotype, right? So he was writing about this decades ago. To date, we don't know that there are single or even varied genetic predispositions to alcoholism for Native folks in any way that would be different for Europeans. There isn't a gene that makes Native people use differently. We know that in America, one of the most likely groups to not use alcohol at all, to totally abstain, is Native people. So, you know, why is there so much research? Why are we choosing to study substance use so much, right? Why is it the thing, if you did a literature search, that would pop up the most? And why is it that so much research gets funded on this topic? And I mean, we can think about that. Like, are we perpetuating myths and fallacies in what we do as researchers? And I am certain that I have done this. I'm being vulnerable with you, but I will share that in the early days of a study I'm going to talk about, probably 90% of the questions we would ask in surveys were horrible. They were things like, is your kid using drugs? Have you been sexually assaulted? Have you beat somebody up lately? Now, these are validated scales and measures, and they were funded, and you know, some of these issues are real issues. But when I would read those questions, imagining answering them about my own child, I cried. And yet I, as a researcher, was asking community members to ask these questions. Are some of those questions still being asked in our studies? Yeah. Yeah, they are. And is that okay? It's not for me to decide, right? So this is where I'm going. How do we study things? What is our approach? The widely cited antidote is this thing called CBPR or TBPR, community or tribally based participatory research. And I'm going to very briefly talk about those things from our study, but I want to pause for a second to see, Josh, if there's any questions popping in from this first part that we should pay attention to.
There is lots of participation in your questions. People have offered their thoughts about the stereotypes that you asked about. There was a comment about confirmational bias as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you everybody for participating. I appreciate that. It makes it more interactive when we can't be in a room together. All right, I will keep going, but feel free to flag me. I'll have another pause shortly.
There was also a question about a link, and I put one in for the Beyond Land acknowledgement into the Q&A box. So hopefully you'll all have that. I also took the liberty, Melissa, of putting in the citation for Vine Deloria Jr.'s book, Custardized for Your Sins, because it gives, I think, a good history of land theft, which you were referring to. And I'll keep popping things in there if that's okay with you.
I love it. Yeah, people.
Right.
I mean, that's why I come to these things, to get resources. Great. Good to learn. Okay, CBPR. Here's our team. Some pictures of our team. And I have been privileged to get to work with some of these partners since 2002. Wow, 20 years. And we do a variety of work together. And I am just a speaker for this whole, as a representative of this team. I recognize the privilege of having a PhD after my name, those 3 letters. The privilege of a university position that allows me to network and meet people. But I want you to know, this work isn't because of me. This work is because of beautiful faces on your screen. So CBPR is an orientation to doing research. It's not a set method. It's not one way. It's not a prescription. You can read a lot about CBPR at the University of New Mexico's website, University of Michigan, Google Scholar. Today, I just want to briefly say that for our team, we really lead with tribal sovereignty and try to think about all the ways that we can respect, honor, and affirm tribal sovereignty in our work. We create structures for community engagement. In our team, that looks like what we call community research councils, who are, the goal is equal partnership along the way of the research process. We make sure results get to communities first. We make sure that the priority is creative dissemination of findings. So we have YouTube channels, we have, social media pages. And this isn't enough. This isn't enough. So I just want to say it's not that we're doing it the best, but I want to be transparent in how we approach CBPR. And there's much more to it, but I want to get into the examples. So healing pathways. I will talk about the healing pathways study. This is an ongoing study of Indigenous family development. We started back in 2002. And we just got refunded through the next 5 years to continue this study. So in brief, back in 2002, we did 8 years of surveys with what we call HP, Healing Pathways Youth. They're considered Generation 2, and their parents or their caregivers. That's Generation 1, G1. So we have 8 years of 2-generation data. Skipping ahead, we revisited that second generation, those target participants, when they were young adults, and we've recently learned from them. And now we're funded to enroll their children in the study. So we'll have 3 generations of data on Indigenous development. Quick note, back in 2002, the Pathways kids were 10, 11, 12 years old. So as we sit here today, they're 31, 32, 33 years of age. In the early years of Healing Pathways, I was actually a graduate student for a lot of this. We really heard from communities, culture is the answer to any health issue we have. Culture as medicine, culture as treatment, culture confers well-being. Any community I've ever worked with that is Indigenous, this is what I hear. So your question is, what do you mean by culture? As a researcher, I say, what is that? How do I measure it? Can I measure it? And again, in those early days, we thought about culture as this thing we called enculturation. And it included things like, do you speak your traditional language? Do you have a positive ethnic identity? Do you engage in the traditional practices of your culture? And we heard elders talk about this. We heard community members talk about these things. So in a lot of ways, those measures were culturally community determined. So people would say things about the importance of identity, the need to practice traditional ways, and the feeling when you speak your language. They would talk about this with us. And we had some success in terms of, I guess, measuring some of those cultural factors in a survey as best we could, and showing the Western scientific world that those cultural factors led to better things. Like for kids, they were more academically successful if they were higher on those cultural measures. They had lower suicidal ideation, lower rates of substance use disorders. And adults, across a variety of studies, we found higher flourishing mental health status. I'm actually bringing in a couple of other studies on this slide around diabetes, where we learned that culture really led to better diabetes control and outcomes, and so on and so forth. So that's good, right? Back in the early 2000s, even 2010s, even maybe 5 years ago, even today, people don't always listen to our communities when we say culture is healing, culture is medicine. But some people will listen to an academic article. I don't know, this is the way the world works. And so it's good that we were able to tell this story in a partnership. But it wasn't that easy. The work is like far from done. And so I'm going to walk you through a cautionary tale. I will tell you what all these numbers mean. I mean, not all of them, I'll make it brief, but this is what we call a regression model, which is really just, can you predict an outcome accounting for a bunch of variables? And in these models, we were trying to predict Indigenous depression, anxiety, and anger symptoms from our sample of Healing Pathways. In this first model, when we account for everybody's self-reported gender, we found that those who reported more traditional spiritual activity involvement also were more depressed. So this positive coefficient, this positive number, and the stars are telling you that there's a positive relationship. As one goes up, the other one goes up, and it's statistically significant. Same thing with spirituality and anxiety, same thing with spirituality and anger. This is not what we expect, right? We expect that people who report more traditionality would have healthier mental health outcomes. So this would happen, when we're working, cleaning data, running a bunch of statistics, playing with different variables, trying to figure out the story. And I have to say, there's so much braveness in our community team to say, let's tell the world this story, but let's finish the story. So this is only part of the story, as you probably can see from the slides. Here's the rest of it. When we step in variables like me being discriminated against, or this measure of historical trauma that we call historical cultural loss. That positive, significant relationship between spirituality and mental health, it's gone. And in some of the models, the sign would flip and it would become an inverse relationship. What this is telling us is that this stuff is complicated. It's complicated. People don't always account for the culturally rooted stressors. I wouldn't call them culturally rooted. I would say the stressors that are associated with living in a racist world, right? And some of those things are discrimination and historical trauma. And when we measure those, the way tradition and culture work looks differently. I'm going to drill down on this a little more. I'm going to use a term from Joe Gahn, Dr. Joe Gahn, one of my colleagues at Harvard. He calls it the postcolonial predicament. Others have written about this as well. In a modern society, we are both trying to heal from the historical assaults of colonization, and we're still living with it. I showed you the Halloween costumes, right? There's ongoing stuff lingering. We still have underfunded Indian health service systems. We still have invisibility issues. We're erased. We still have stereotypes, all these things. So in that post-colonial predicament, we don't just have, like unicorns and rainbows that we're dancing around with when we engage with our culture. We're still living in this hard world. And that helps to explain what I showed you on the prior slide. In addition, our culture has been attacked, Indigenous culture, and a lot has been corrupted or lost and is being reclaimed. I'll give you an example. Some of the traditional activities that elders would want us to assess include living off the land. And an indicator of that is hunting. But as one elder, Murphy Thomas, taught me, to go on a hunt and to get a deer, great. Now you have venison to feed your community, your family. But did you put out your asema for that deer? Did you sing the song that we're supposed to sing when we take that life? Did you ... Are we measuring that, right? So what is culture? How do you measure it? It's very complex. Furthermore, the era of residential schools, boarding schools in the US, in Canada, included turning a lot of Native people into Christians, conversion. A lot of them were church-run schools. So my great-grandfather survived a residential school and was converted to Catholicism, for example. In a focus group discussion, I heard 3 different ways to interpret this from some First Nations community members. I have them on the screen. One man said, when he was thinking about this complexity, well, I was taught that our way, the way of the pipe, respect. Another man said, what I believe is our people, our roots are here, Turtle Island. Christianity, I don't know where that came from, but that's where their roots are. And so I think that when our people say they're Christians, they're like a plant without roots. At the same discussion, a woman said, I'm proud I became Christian. And when I became Christian, that's when they all came and said, you've gone the wrong way. You've gone the wrong way. But to me, I found a way. And it worked for me. And not until the day I became a Christian, I found love. So how can we be all these things? Respecting all ways, knowing our own roots, finding love in Christianity. Guess what? We're complex humans. We're all these things. Indigenous peoples are all these things. How do you measure that? That is my lifelong question. Should I even try? Can I try? And so far, community team members have said, let's try. So I'm going to now show you how we've tried to innovate on these measures, and I'll keep this part pretty brief and then we'll pause again. So moving forward with healing pathways in these latest waves of data collection, we've really started to think about measuring culture as much more. It could be our sense of belonging, our purpose. It could be what our colleagues in Alaska have called multicultural or multidimensional mastery, this idea that I get what I can do what I can do because my family, my community's got my back. You know, we got this together, like this communal sense of mastery. We could measure values, we could measure worldview. Extended kinship, Indigenous families continue to be big, and lots of players, lots of aunties, uncles, cousins, siblings, friends are raising little ones. Side note, Healing Pathways data tells us that when a child has many extended family members helping to raise them, they have better outcomes. So that's cool. We also can just celebrate strengths. I mean, this gets us back to that initial essay I shared with you, the beauty of our souls, the beauty of our communities. And so that's really fun. All right, but let's look at cultural measures just briefly. So back to that post-colonial predicament, right? Like, if we're in this complex, modern, twisted place, how does culture work? One thing that I hear and I personally have experienced is what I am going to name cultural angst or anxiety about engaging with my language, my culture, because I wasn't always taught the ways, right? I was taught some ways, certainly not all the ways. Some ceremonies are still being reclaimed. It's not like, you know, on Sunday morning, you can turn on public access TV and see how people act at church. We can't just like turn on the TV as Indigenous peoples and learn how to act at ceremony, right? So these things were hidden on purpose to save them when they were illegal. And now some of us struggle to access those cultural ways. And so on our team, we've tried to measure this thinking about a concept we're tentatively calling cultural efficacy. So it's sort of like measuring the degree of wanting and ability to engage with culture. So I know who to ask to learn. I know how to act in traditional spaces. I want to do this. I want to be a role model for Anishinaabe or other tribal peoples in whatever your context is. So we tested a model that looks like what you see on your screen. We used some of our old cultural variables, and our guess is, you know, more culture, better mental health. But then we said, maybe this cultural efficacy thing, this sense that I have access to it and I know how to access it and I feel comfortable with it, is playing a role in between. And lo and behold, it does. We just published this paper this year. And the year is flying by, everybody. I hope you all feel the same way. I was like, wow, 2022 is still here. And what we indeed find is that cultural efficacy is related to better mental health outcomes, whether positive or negative ones. And it acts as a mediator between those cultural activities or variables I showed you and the outcomes. So very briefly, enculturation by itself is actually related to more anxiety. But if you account for cultural efficacy, that mediated pathway, that what we call indirect effect, is actually positive, right? So this variable is telling us something explanatory in these types of models. This is a lot. We don't have to read this all off, but I want to share that I always say that the two most robust predictors of good Indigenous health outcomes are culture and community. But that means a lot of things. Excuse me. So we did basically what's called a higher order factor analysis. Dane Houdala on our team ran these figures. And long story short, things like social support, community support, positive cultural identification, they relate to good stuff, good outcomes. But when you load them all together on what we call a higher order factor or a higher order construct that we called socio-cultural support and integration, the whole predicts more than the sum of its parts. There's something more powerful about those things coming together than sitting by themselves. So we played with this a little more and brought in some more measures of social support, cultural mastery, cultural identification, this social connection, and awareness of connectedness is a measure of your literal awareness of being connected to nature, to spirituality, to other generations, to family and friends, things like that. When we looked at the patterns of responses people gave on these items, the story is complex again, right? Not everybody uniformly answers this, but there seems to be three groups that fall out of the bucket, so to say. There's a group that answers high on most of them, a group that's right around the middle, and then a group that's lower on most things, but high on cultural identification, well, higher on cultural identification than the other items. And this is important to me because it tells you the story of diversity within Native communities. And you wouldn't be shocked to know that the people in that high integration group have the best physical, mental, and spiritual health. And that tells me we need to get access to all of these indicators for the others. And maybe it's not just access, but teaching, exposure to teachings, access to elders. How can we do that? I think we need to be doing better, to pay our elders, to take care of our elders, to make sure our cultural knowledge bearers can earn a living doing what they do in this modern society. Again, that's complex, that's hard, but in order for us to have access, we need their time, and their time is precious. So I'm going to pause now and see if there's any questions coming in.
So this is so important and so helpful. Thank you so much, Melissa. And to sort of begin to think about some of the distinctions between cultural efficacy and cultural identification. So important for you to parse that out for us. So lots of comments. The written word is a value upheld in white supremacy. So I'm not surprised that the value of a published academic paper or study is what was listened to. Another comment, we must be mindful that even though we may ground and strengthen ourselves in our cultural spirituality, our BIPOC internal culturalisms aren't accepted or, at worst, denied and looked down on.
Yeah.
Celebrating our true cultural selves is an active act of defiance, which is sort of a twist on what you said earlier about the relationship between spiritual and cultural involvement and the depression and anxiety that comes from the historical and ongoing trauma associated with being in and living one's culture. Someone else said that they're using an article by Joe Gahn for their research. And so I put a couple of citations from his work in there. He's also really influenced my thinking. So here's two questions. One is a link for Sarah Sunshine Manning's article. I looked it up, but I didn't catch the title, Melissa. So, and then here's the question. Which among the 574 federally recognized tribes mostly get left out of the kind of research you do? And what therefore is lost or simply unknown? And I would add to that, there are tribes that are not federally recognized, but state recognized, some that aren't recognized by feds or state. And then there, as you said, are 70% of Native Americans, Alaska Natives who live in urban settings and not on reservations, may or may not be enrolled in tribes. So who mostly get left out of this kind of research, and what is then lost or unknown?
Yeah, there are huge inequities in what we know in terms of research about the diversity of Indigenous communities. So that question, right on, because as you point out, Josh, most Native people live in urban areas. Very little research is being done in urban areas with Indigenous peoples. Small tribes with low resources, I've seen that sometimes they're left behind because that's a lot of work. That's hard. You're hard to access. You're like, it's not okay, but it's true. And I think at the National Institutes of Health, this conversation was on public record with regards to what's called NARCH, the Native American Research Centers for Health, that the tribes that are most competitive to get NARCH funding are the tribes that are already pretty well resourced. So I just appreciate you bringing that question/comment forward because it is so true. And how do we examine our own perpetuation of those inequities as people in these professions that we're all in, right? Yeah, it's a big deal.
So two more questions for now. One is from a colleague of ours right here at Boston Children's Hospital. This is a researcher's question. It's an interesting one. I'm curious also if folks with depression/anxiety are turning more towards traditional spirituality and culturation as a part of a healing coping process. So could that also help to partially explain some of the positive association that you saw in your data between people involved with spirituality and people with more depression and anxiety?
Yes, we think so. So we have longitudinal data, and way long ago when I did a dissertation, I looked at that very time-ordered question with suicidality, because my suspicion was the kids who might have suicide ideation were being rescued, and you're going to ceremony, we're bringing you to an elder. And there was some evidence of that, definitely, that culture can be a treatment response or a coping response. So I think that's part of the equation for sure.
And then lots more comments. One more question, because I know you have more for us. How can non-Native service providers promote cultural efficacy?
Yep. So my favorite literature on service providers when I used to teach medical students was cultural safety literature. I think it's just a wonderful framework to recognize that the work starts with you, like it starts with ourselves in terms of investigating, interrogating, privilege, all of that. And second, always there has to be community partnership, right? So in the spaces where you work, can you and your agency build partnerships with Native communities, build programming, support programming, give money to things? So it's not just that activities are being supported, but that teachings are available. You have to be careful because you can quickly become someone who's co-opting our culture. So that's where cultural safety comes in, I think. All right, so Josh, I'll continue. I just have a few more fun things, I think, hopefully fun, and then we can wind it down. First, not so fun. I'm sure most people who would come to this particular group's webinar know about adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. So we know that across Indian country, Indigenous communities, ACEs are quite high. So ACEs are these early childhood, negative, stressful, traumatic experiences. And the top bar represents prevalence of ACEs reported by our Healing Pathways participants. The bottom bar is from general population sample. Huge inequity, right? This is not cool, this is not okay, and this is a direct result of historical trauma. There's great literature on this. And problematic because ACEs are directly linked to all kinds of negative health, developmental outcomes over your entire life. So those early childhood and adolescent years matter for what happens later. We could talk about ACEs all day. I do think that this is an important area of work. I think trauma-informed treatments and care are important. I also think it's only part of our story. Do I have some of these aces? Many of them. I do. I'm telling you this, I do. But I don't want you to see me only as the aces in me. I want you to see the positive things. And so I heard a talk actually at a conference, NCRE, that Josh and I both go to, by researchers in Colorado who were exploring angels in the nursery, is what one of their articles was titled. And they were looking at benevolent childhood experiences, positive childhood experiences. And they were asking people about their early life, good stuff. And so we said, well, let's ask Healing Pathways participants. Did you, when you were a kid, have good neighbors? Did you have a caregiver you felt safe with? Did you have predictable home routines? Overwhelming majority of the Healing Pathways kids had all of these things when they were kids. And they also had higher prevalence of what we saw in some published articles. The other piece of this story is, again, now I'm going to predict flourishing, which is a really nice mental health outcome. And this is just another set of regression equations. So when I'm accounting for things like age and gender, these BCEs, these positive childhood experiences, they significantly predict adult flourishing. So early childhood good stuff is predicting me having flourishing mental health when I'm a young adult. Now, that's not causal, right? These are associations, but what you can see is that when you step in adverse childhood experiences, those also, in this model here where I'm circling, if you can see it, they predict flourishing in the opposite way, right? So they're a risk factor against being flourishing later on. When we stepped in family satisfaction in young adulthood and current adult emotional support, so what you're getting right now as a young adult, the effects of ACEs were washed away, but look what hung on these last models. Benevolent childhood experiences remained a significant predictor of young adult flourishing for these Indigenous community members. This is big because the only story I often told was about these ACEs here, right? If I go backwards, wow, I have to tell the BCE story, and wow, this is part of my narrative, right? Those protective factors matter and they last into young adulthood. One last example for you, this is winding us down, is another example of positive mental health. This is a measure called the Mental Health Continuum short form by Corey Keyes, Keyes. And that measure assesses flourishing, languishing, and moderate mental health. So here I'm showing you flourishing. The blue are the first bars are flourishing levels. In the first two studies are studies of Indigenous peoples that I've been the PI on in the Midwest here. You can see really high rates of flourishing, like 50% or higher are reaching this flourishing status. The comparison studies are yoga practitioners and college students. So these two studies, Minogijigat and Gathering for Health, I forgot to mention, they are adults living with chronic disease. So these are people who are not well in a physical sense, yet their flourishing is on par with or above national comparison studies of yoga practitioners and college students. I know college students sometimes have, there's mental health issues in that community. So I don't want to say that, there's no issues there, but it's interesting, right? That chronic disease still flourishing. Depression rates also were higher in our community sample compared to the comparison studies. But my point always is, for so many years, the only story I told, I'm telling you, the only publications, you can look them up, that I did were about all these bad things. And what was that doing to me? What was that doing to my psyche, to my identity? Well, I will tell you, either I didn't see myself in the data, or I thought of the sickest, people on the planet and like just somehow othered all of the members of my community who were represented in these data. And only when I start to celebrate the strengths alongside the struggles do I start to feel seen in the data. So how do participants feel? They must feel similarly. So we are not there yet. We're still trying, but these are just a couple of examples. And I'll end with 2 slides of quotes. So first, I never would have guessed that being a research participant in and of itself made people feel good. But we've started asking open-ended questions at the end of surveys. People can write in to us. What's it like for you to be in this study? I mean, should we keep it going? What's problematic? 99.9% of the time, we get comments like this. This project has made me feel more connected. I have made it an important part of my life to make culture a bigger part of who I am because of this study, because they read and ask questions about culture. It's made me want to continue my education and bring knowledge back to Native communities. We ask them survey questions once a year, and people are saying that this is what it does for them. I think it's a lot about A, the community team, the interviewers they know, and B, the types of questions being asked of them. And last, I told you I would end with a personal story. These are pictures. This is my great-grandpa. He passed when I was 12. My great-grandma's down below. She's in the middle row. She passed when I was 22. He's a survivor of a residential school. His wife, their family, went off res to escape the residential school. And my cousin Dean McMahon said that as a result of both of these situations, one staying on the reserve and being shipped to the residential school on the reserve, and the other bouncing off to save their family, we lost our culture, our identity, our home, our kinship, but we survived. We are here. We will remain and flourish as we journey to become who we always were. Be proud, be active, be loud, be kind, gentle, and walk a good path. Our ancestors are among us and guiding us as we return to the circle, one by one. So with that, just say miigwech, chi-miigwech, thank you so much. And I think we're close to the end, Josh, so I'll kick it over to you.
Oh, Melissa, thank you so much. I wondered, actually, since you told that story, if you would be okay with saying what led to your starting to look for the positives. Was there something that flipped for you there?
I think it's a lot of things. On a personal note, it was joining a Indigenous women's running group. I would call us hiking. We hike, but we sort of run. And being out on the trails with all these other Native women and realizing like our story isn't in the stuff I'm doing, and we're not just languishing around here. We're kicking ass. And so I was like, okay, we got to do that. 2 is all this narrative shifting work happening with Indigenous grassroots groups. Man, does that get me going. Indian Collective, Illuminatives, all of these awesome screenwriters and actors, Reservation Dogs Now, right? Like Rutherford Falls, all these things happening. It's sort of all a swirling storm, and it's only going to blow up more. But really it was about, hey, I'm doing a study about Anishinaabe health and I don't see myself in it. And that was a realization that came only like 10 years after getting a PhD, and I'm still working on it every day.
That's so great. Someone commented about taking back the data, and you're also talking about taking back the story and figuring out what your story is. Thank you so much, Melissa. I'm so grateful for your work and for you and for your journey. And I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us today. I hope that you'll come back. We hope to see you soon, actually after the election, and please go vote and go see our webinar on learning to advocate for children as you think about voting. But on December 7th, our next Learning to Listen conversation will be with Linda Smith, Director of the Bipartisan Policy Council, and she'll talk with us about what the midterm elections tell us about who is listening to the children and their families, and what we can expect policymakers on both sides of the aisle, what we can expect they will and won't do on behalf of children and families. Also, on Monday, this coming Monday, our Somos Latinx Families conversation series by and for with Latinx families continues. That's Monday, October 31st at 3 p.m. Eastern. And then our conversation series, Parenting While Rising to Developmental Challenges, continues through December 19th. The next one is November 7th. That's again a Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And as I mentioned, our advocacy series continues on November 15th. That will be after the election, but the others will be posted at browsingtouchpoints.org. And finally, you may want to check out our new training, Addressing Child Behaviors That Challenge, that begins on November 1st, and our Beyond Trauma-Informed Care workshop, where we will focus on the positives and the joy to. Thank you all, and we hope to see you all soon.